Luca certainly bought Pistelli on this point about entering the crime scene. Luca calmly fought Pistelli on this point about entering the crime scene, certain that he was right. And as the defense pointed out, even the investigator seemed to feel that Pistelli wasn't telling the truth. That's why they'd insisted to give them his shoe size so that they could be sure he hadn't made the bloody footprint by the bed himself. If he could lie about this, the defense asked the court, then why believe him when he says he arrived at 12:30 p.m.? Our client, Raffaelli, has cell phone records that can tell you exactly what time he had called the Carbonari, and are supposed to believe that this man, when he says that Amanda and Raffaelli were whispering together like two accomplices, about how when he says the famous broken glass in Philomena's room wasn't on top of the clothes. The International Press Corps came out in full force the next weekend for the eagerly awaited testimony of Meredith's English friends, 7 in all, flown in at public expense to dish one last time about Amanda Knox. A reporter spotted Natalie Hayward, one of the British girls, at breakfast time with her parents at the Fortuna Hotel on the Piazza Italia on February 13, 2009, the day of their testimony. Natalie was a tall girl with dark blonde hair, wearing a sweater with a long skirt and high boots. Her mother had been brought dried cereal, evidently from the UK, in a plastic bag, and begged her daughter to eat some before her testimony to keep up her strength. Natalie shook her head. Yogurt then, something to settle your stomach. The mother waited for a while. You know, dear, maybe you should come back with your father and me and not stay here with the other girls. It was the carnival time in Perugia. The bakeries made special treats, the merchants put up the decorations, the bars filled up, a lovely time to be there if one wasn't in court. Natalie got up from the table and became rather charming, pouring heart tea for her mother, smiling, chatting with her father. Later that morning, a photographer snapped Natalie with the other girls, their wool coats buttoned against the cold, scarves wrapped around their necks. As they approached the courthouse, he took one perfect shot of the group as snowflakes started to fall. The girls started running. They raced uphill to Cafe Perugia and disappeared inside. Robin Butterworth was the first of Meredith's British friends to take the stand. She was a tall, brown-haired girl who posed with Meredith and Sophie, both petite, in many of the Facebook photos. In real life, her features were much softer and prettier than they appeared in snapshots. The rumor was that the girls were going to nail Amanda, even though none of them had described her as alarming in their first witness reports. She was just Meredith's friend Amanda, identified as a flatmate who used to go out for dinner with Meredith. But Robin and Amy in particular became very suspicious of Amanda after her arrest. The nailing talk had begun when Menini traveled to Bergamo, in northern Italy, to interview Amy and Robin there in the spring of 2008. He had managed to assemble 6 girls, although in court at least one claimed they'd arrived at Bergamo coincidentally, somehow deciding to visit Italy and stop off to see their good friends at the exact same time. In court, prosecutor Giuliani Mangione encouraged each girl to gossip freely about Amanda, to chronicle her every fault, and to repeat every bit of hearsay, to cast suspicion, to give opinions, even though Meredith wasn't there to protect a misimpression. She couldn't say, as roommates typically do, "Oh, I was just venting that day, it wasn't a big deal." Under Menini's guidance, Robin brought up Meredith's complaint about the unflushed toilet, which the prosecutor morphed into an accusation of general piggishness. Robin delivered this revelation in a somber, shocked tone, with the earnestness of English girls, as Frank Sforza put it. The prosecutor's theory, as he would explain in closing arguments, was that Amanda hated Meredith because the British girl had criticized her. So on November 1st, when Amanda discovered that she didn't have to go to work, she decided to take her revenge. At 8:45 p.m., after talking to Giovanna Popovic, who said that the American girl appeared completely normal, not drunk or angry as Manini would contend, Amanda somehow went into a drug-fueled rage. She insisted that Raffaelli go to the cottage with her and to wreak havoc on Meredith, despite not knowing where the British girl was at the time or when she'd gotten home. Amanda grabbed a large kitchen knife from the cutlery drawer, according to this theory, and stashed it in her purse right after she'd finished watching the whimsical Amelie with Raffaelli on DVD. Somehow, on the 5-minute walk over to the cottage, they encountered Rudy, who didn't have a cell phone, whose email address they didn't have, who had never met Raffaelli. The couple immediately decided to stage an orgy with him, even though they never expressed any interest in group sex before and had known each other only 6 days. When they got to the cottage, Meredith was either already there or came in shortly afterward. Amanda, Manini told her that she was sick of the criticisms, accusing her roommate of being prissy, and said, "You're going to have sex with us." Meredith refused, and then the knives came out. Not just a kitchen knife, but also one that Raffaelli supposedly had brought with him. Rudy sexually violated her, and then Amanda slashed her throat, assisting in some way by Raphael. For the prosecution, the problem with this story was that at 8:45 p.m. it was pure invention. Manini didn't pretend otherwise. "We can't hypothesize," the prosecutor liked to say. "We can imagine, we can make the supposition that, etc." Now, Robin had accidentally undermined his case by saying that Meredith had been too classy and reserved to discuss her issues with Amanda directly, who couldn't hardly be expected then to kill her over them if she wasn't aware of Meredith's complaints in the first place. So Manini switched gears. Although all 4 flatmates were sexually active and smoked marijuana, he now portrayed Amanda as a depraved girl in an otherwise covenant-like household who had exposed her British roommate to sexually explicit materials. The shocking news was that Amanda had kept a clear plastic bag on the floor under the sink since there was no other place to store it in the tiny room. Filled with all of her personal toiletries, some of the investigators had evidently poked through it after Amanda's arrest and after Meredith had shown it to Robin. "What are the contents?" Manini asked her. Meredith pointed out a beauty case with condoms and I think a vibrator, Robin said as she described visiting the cottage for what seemed to be the only time. Amanda was out that day. In fact, she and Robin had scarcely ever been in the same room. So why were the 2 British girls checking out Amanda's toiletries stored in a plastic bag in the American's own bathroom? Robin didn't want to explain. "Did you see the condoms? Did you see the vibrator?" Manini kept pressuring her. "I did not look inside the bag," Robin finally said, adding that she was only in the bathroom to brush her hair. While bent over this task, she spotted the bag on the floor after Meredith had showed it to her. No, she finally admitted she could not see the objects inside, nor did Manini explain why seeing a condom would shock anyone, since condoms with devilish names were displayed in Italian drugstores and could be purchased on the street corner machines, even across from the university for foreigners. Nevertheless, Amanda's condoms and vibrator lit up the day's coverage. Manini had had a genius for inserting these spicy nuggets into the morning testimony, ensuring that the sexy stuff would make it into the newspapers, unlike the later cross-examination by the defense. Amanda's attorney, Luciana Gregara, would criticize several Perugia police officers, referring them to as the women of the Perugia flying squad for clashing with his client, saying that they disliked Amanda right away because they found condoms and a vibrator while exploring her private beauty case. He said that Amanda suffered from the result of this antagonism. Next, Manini asked Robin about Halloween, the last dinner party with Meredith, and the night at the Questera when Amanda had upset the English girls by not crying when they cried, responding stiffly to Sophie Purton's hug, talking loudly to her Seattle friends on the phone, and, well, being insensitive to the needs of others. "Why did you tell the police that Amanda was proud of finding the body?" Manini asked. "Because she kept saying, 'I found her, and it could have been me.'" "And you told British authorities that Amanda was proud of finding the body?" "Yes, that was the absolute truth, because I thought that she was proud." To many reporters, the British girl's testimony sounded numbingly rehearsed. Somehow every girl, while emotionally distraught, had heard Amanda make the same remarks at the Questera, no matter where she was sitting or at what time. They had all listened in on her private phone calls. They had all watched her interact with her boyfriend. As Frank Sforza wrote in Perugia Shock, the version of the English girls provided were almost identical and perfectly coherent to each other, just as if they were from one person. Many elements were passed from one of them to the others, but at the police station they were all common eyewitnesses as to what was going on, even if someone heard something that the others couldn't hear. The only notable difference was, for what it may count, was that some of them Amanda referred to having seen the blood and then taking the shower. For others of them, it was the opposite. Not all the girls ripped into Amanda, however. Helen Powell had said she thought that the American was just upset and trying to put a good face on things. Jade Bidwell and Samantha Rudenhurst admitted that they hadn't cried either. They all felt terribly sad and upset, of course, but tears hadn't flowed. Some girls had hugged Meredith's other roommates, Laura Mazzetti and Filomena Romanelli, but nobody saw them sobbing either. Jade Bidwell said that the American girl wasn't the only person saying strange things that night. Amanda said that she was in the wardrobe, but somebody else said Meredith was on the bed or on the floor, so everybody has their own version. In any case, Rudy came out worst in all of this because none of the girls had seen him talking to Meredith on Halloween, as he'd claimed, nor had she ever mentioned him. They actually helped Amanda a bit because it turned out that the details she'd given them about the murder were wrong. Therefore, she didn't know things only the killer would know. During all this testimony, Amanda sat quiet, rubbing her eyes, looking tired. When it was finally over, she rose slowly from her chair. She smiled and fidgeted. The vibrator was just a toy, she finally said, a little pink rabbit. A gag gift that a friend had given her before she left for Europe. She spread her fingers about an inch apart, demonstrating how small it was. Why I had a rabbit toy at the murder house was one of the many headlines sparked by this revelation, which was a pity because the broken-hearted Sophie Purton spoke beautifully about her friend Meredith, and so did the other girls. They all sat in with their parents at the courtroom afterward. Sophie cried, and Robin was visibly shaking. For Manini, though it had all been a triumph, he would continue to argue that Amanda had killed Meredith over complaints, even though his own witness, Robin, had said that Meredith never shared her complaints with Amanda. After court, Kurt Knox, Amanda's father, spoke to reporters, making his usual attempt at damage control. "You have 7 young ladies, and it appears they have amazingly consistent points of views," he said. "They made virtually the same set of comments. That raises a question." As for Amanda's behavior at the Cuestera, she was the only person who spoke English, so she was asked to speak to others who spoke English. Furthermore, everybody reacts differently to stress. You go through many different moods when something terrible happens: anger, sadness, even giddiness. Amanda had been dealing with the death for many hours when she met the English girls. She had been thrown out of her home. She had nowhere to live. Was her behavior right for her? Probably yes. Was it right for the people around her? Maybe not. The next day in court, Amanda created a spectacle by showing up casually dressed in jeans and a long white t-shirt with "All You Need Is Love" emblazoned in pink, a tribute to her favorite Beatles song. Although some of the male reporters took this as Amanda flaunting her sexuality, her friend DJ said that she was simply reacting to the criticisms heaped on her from the day before. She believed in the message of the song and thought that if people would be kind to one another, many problems could be solved. Laura Mazzetti, one of Amanda's Italian roommates and a newly crowned lawyer herself, smiled and smiled all through her testimony that same morning. One of her roommates had been murdered, and the other sat in front of her, facing 30 years in prison, life imprisonment in Italy. Yet the only time Laura stopped smiling was when Amanda's attorney asked her a few questions. "Amanda will not idolize Laura anymore, it seems," Frank Sforza said, calling Laura the Queen of Smiles. Laura had come with an agenda too, and it was not a pretty one. She spoke of a mysterious mark on Amanda's neck, which she said that she had noticed at the Cuestera that first night. The implications was that this mark, clearly visible in photos of Amanda standing with Raffaele outside the cottage right after the body was found, was a cut or a bruise sustained during a vicious fight with Meredith. Indeed, in the blogosphere, this small red mark had been noticed, and it had grown larger and larger until it became a gaping sore and wound. Laura said that she hadn't noticed the mark only out of concern for her roommate. She wanted to make sure that Amanda was all right, yet she told Manini about it only recently in one of her many witness statements. When Amanda's lawyers told her that it was a hickey, a love bite, Laura insisted that no, it was a scratch. Later, Amanda would testify that it was a hickey, and her father would point out that Amanda had been photographed when she was arrested and that the mark had already faded by then. Laura didn't help the defense by saying that nobody in the house drank much. They might have had a glass of wine for dinner, but that was all. That would prove useful when Prosecutor Manini threw alcohol into the drug-fueled mix that had supposedly fed the sex game. Laura also admitted that she smoked hashish at times, as did Meredith, and Meredith's boyfriend Giacomo Salenzi, but none of them appeared to be more than casual users. Next up were the two of the boys from downstairs apartment, Giacomo and Stefano Benazzi. The normally deadpan jurors smiled when Giacomo admitted that he'd been growing marijuana in a special locked room. He also testified that Amanda had gotten along just fine with Meredith. The prosecutor wanted both boys to say that Rudy had a tremendous crush on Amanda, but all he wedged out of them was the "is she available" remark he had made the first time he met her. Rudy, they said, was a basketball guy who socialized easily when he was drunk. That day, Raffaele sprang to life when the court played the recording of his 112 call to the Carbonari on November 2nd, 2007. He swiveled around in his chair and smiled at friends, looking proud. As his lawyers pointed out, his voice was loud and clear in the recording, as if he weren't concerned about the postal police overhearing him make this call, as if, in other words, the postal police weren't there yet. At the end of the day, Amanda again exercised her right to speak under the law, her right under the law to speak, which she did in Italian as always. She said that she was saddened to hear about the complaints from her roommates after all this time. This business of cleaning was extremely exaggerated, she said, and I always had a good relationship with those girls. It really wasn't like that. Now began a long parade of police officers describing the investigation. More days were devoted to the postal police controversy, not to mention blood spatters, fingerprints, and DNA, with no one agreeing on anything. And it all awaited a re-airing when the defense took the stand. As for Amanda's interrogation, each officer said that she had been treated perfectly, given every legal right, offered espresso and a brooch. And anyways, look how the girl acts. The cartwheels, the disrespect. There are no words other for describing this unbelievable character of our time, wrote Frank Sforza on Perugia Shock. Actress, lovebird, bad girl, and now even dancer, the gymnast at the police station. In fact, the cartwheels came up so often that he did an inventory. Napoleoni. Amanda was doing cartwheels and splits. Zuccherini. Amanda was doing the cartwheel. Ficara. I came out of the elevator and I saw Amanda doing the cartwheel and the splits. When Amanda's team posted that she'd only done yoga poses, the officers took offense. As Frank Sforza wrote, I can tell the difference between yoga and dancing, the policewoman reacts. I've seen her doing a real cartwheel, turning upside down on her hands and then landing on her feet. In another moment, I saw her doing a split. All my colleagues have seen it. Why should we lie about that? You can just look at the way she acts in the courtroom. Actually, as pointed out, Amanda didn't do anything strange in the courtroom, except maybe the time of the t-shirt, a really unforgivable eccentricity. Anyway, clearly we have a sporty woman and a free spirit. Now let's go back to the case. After days and days of police testimony of her interrogation, Amanda finally rose to protest. I just want to insist that witnesses are not saying the truth about the night between November 5th and the 6th. I wanted to clarify some events that for me are very important. There are hours and hours before Raffaele ever said that I wasn't with him. They are very, very aggressive on this story of the messages. They call me a liar. And then there are those scapulatali, little slaps that I really did receive on the head. Raffaele, too, got up to protest the things that hadn't been handled as they were being described. I just wish to respond to what I've heard today, that I stayed a very short time barefoot at the police station and that I was asked and I wanted to call a lawyer. That is absolutely not true. I couldn't call a lawyer, not even my father. The prosecution brought in a long string of witnesses with mixed successes. Nara Capozzali, the witness who'd heard the scream on the night Meredith was murdered, got confused toward the end of her testimony and couldn't be sure if she'd heard the scream the night before or the day before. Curatolo, aka Toto, the homeless man who testified at the pretrial that he'd seen Amanda and Raffaele on the basketball court in Piazza Gramana on November 1st, casing out the cottage, also became confused. When he had first told his story to investigators, he appeared to be describing Halloween night since he remembered masks and witches. But under skillful guidance, he settled firmly on November 1st. The problem for this witness was, now that he was a little too firm about having seen Raffaele and Amanda on the fateful night. Now he thought he'd seen them casing the house all evening up until 11 p.m., giving the two students alibis, as the press was quick to point out. For this reason, Manini had to move the time of death to 11:30 in his closing arguments, even though the coroner had said that Meredith had died within 2 to 3 hours of her last meal, which had been around 6:30 p.m. Then there was this infamous Albanian witness who claimed that he'd had an altercation with all three suspects the night before the crime. Not only was he arrested for possession of cocaine shortly before his court appearance, but his testimony was so riddled with falsehoods that it invoked laughter. He claimed that Amanda had an Italian uncle, that he had met the two suspects in August before they had even met each other. He also said that Amanda had large gaps in her teeth, and at the end he came across as delusional. Another witness who claimed that he had seen all three defendants coming out of the cottage with Meredith on October 30th looked foolish when Raffaele proved that he was at a party near that time. The witness had insisted that Amanda wore a red coat, although she hadn't owned one. Likewise, the store owner who testified that Amanda had come into his Conad store a day after the murder and hovered near the cleaning supplies was contradicted by his own employees who saw no such thing. Meanwhile, Coroner Luca Lawley had come into the courtroom to present his original findings, saying that he had not been able to prove whether the victim had been sexually violated, nor had he ever asserted that she died a long, lingering death. Instead, he said that the victim had probably died within 10 minutes of that last terrible blow, a crucial point in establishing alibis for defendants. However, Lawley's testimony went virtually unreported. DNA was the real star of the show, as it was on CSI, and that's where the prosecutors shone, if only in terms of presentation. They boasted of an unassailable evidence while managing not to reveal for many months exactly how Patrizia Stefanoni had handled all the DNA and had conducted her test in the unaccredited Rome crime lab. The kitchen knife would prove to be the most controversial for the way the DNA results on the blade had been analyzed and reported by Dr. Stefanoni. The knife blade sample that had showed the DNA of Meredith Kercher was on the LCM, the low copy number DNA sample, now also referred to as the LC-DNA or the low template DNA, and may have yielded results not relevant to the case. It's possible for scientists to extract a DNA profile from minute bits of matter, even from a few cells, but following more cautious data interpretation rules, low copy samples should be several times for a consensus profile to develop. A very sterile environment is necessary, as the chances for contamination are higher in low copy work. But while the Rome lab had processed abundant DNA from Meredith Kercher, Stefanoni hadn't even been able to get enough DNA from the blade for a second test, having used up part of the sample in running a test that actually gave the negative result for blood. Also, as was revealed much later, the machine she had used to detect Meredith's DNA had repeatedly warned her that the sample readings were too low, yet she plunged ahead regardless. The Rome Police Forensic Lab also did not provide complete information to the defense on the testing. In the end, Manini and Commodi put a largely circumstantial case built around the eccentricities of one defendant, Amanda Knox. As Frank Safarzo pointed out, There was no end to the crazy things the Seattle actress, gymnast, bad girl, and comedian allegedly did in those days after the crime, but that wasn't the same as evidence. Reporters were still waiting for the smoking gun. Chapter 19, The Defense Speaks. You keep a girl of 20 up all night without a lawyer and take advantage of her naivete, and you can get her to tell the Patrick story. Julia Bongarino, attorney for Raffaele Slegito. I read, study, write, paint, and play soccer, but there is no entertainment that can bring peace. In this nightmarish situation, you find yourself in pitch black darkness, and then the only light that gives you hope of moving forward is your consciousness, which seeks the help of God. Raffaele Slegito, from a letter to an Italian journalist. If accused murderer Amanda Knox testified in court, would anybody believe a word she said? That was the question her defense team faced in early June 2009 after the prosecution finally rested. Amanda had been devastated when Judge Paoli Michelli had ended the pretrial by charging her and Raffaele Slegito with the murder and sexual assault. A few days later, Michelli had delivered another stinging blow. He denied them house arrest, a right he'd freely granted to other murder suspects. Amanda and Raffaele were too dangerous, Judge Michelli said. They were ready to kill again. We're not like that, Amanda had protested. She thought things were looking better. The court had finally accepted when she had told her parents. I was there, she meant. I was at Raffaele's when Meredith's throat was slit. The prosecution had stopped forgetting that she'd said, good evening after see you later. Rudy had told Manini in May that he had made the bloody shoe print by the bed. Police had admitted that Amanda had never called, emailed, or been over to Rudy's place. She listened to her defense team tear into the prosecution's scientific witnesses and rejoiced when they exposed the Albanian super witness as a liar and a clown. Except for that one day of rebellion, she'd worn the Beatles t-shirt. She'd done her best to act appropriately in court. She stood up every time the judge and jurors entered the room, nodded at every single one of them, even though they never looked her in the eyes or any way to acknowledge her. Yet, here she was, still in prison, unable to escape the constant noise or the horror of being locked in. She did her best to establish a healthy routine. She wrote poetry, read books, and tried to avoid news reports on TV. She kept up her guitar lessons, took special designing UW correspondence courses, and studied Chinese and German. She counted the days between family visits, which took place twice a week. She waited for the 10-minute phone call that she was allowed to make to the Mellis home in Seattle each week. Her college friends stayed overnight at her mother's house so that they could speak to her during that precious time. She'd written a mountain of letters, more than 600 since her imprisonment, managing not to release a single detail that could be spun against her. The girl who had once told the world everything she learned, how to mask her thoughts. But Amanda was lonely. Though she now had 3 cellmates, none of them wanted to talk to her. She confided to her mother because they'd read in an Italian magazine that she had complained about them. All she said was that they were awesome, a typical American expression taken as an insult. The girl whom the prison guards had taken to calling Bambi couldn't seem to say anything right. In fact, prosecutor Giuliani Manini had put Amanda under investigation for slander after she stood up in court to directly contradict the account of Monica Napoleoni and the other officers gave of the bed and breakfast treatment they claimed to have shown her at the Questera. Meanwhile, a parallel investigation into whether police actually did hit her was going nowhere, and Manini would wait until Amanda's parents showed up at the closing arguments to smack them with the defamation suit as well, because they had told the Times of London that Amanda said she was hit. Now their daughter had a decision to make. Should she follow Raffaelle's lead and remain silent, or should she speak out? Her lawyers and family members encouraged her to take the stand, believing that she'd be her own best witness. They said that she could have a chance to tell her story to a worldwide audience because her testimony would be videotaped and posted on the web in perpetuity. So her answer was yes. When she decided to tell her tale in Italian, because she'd suffered from clumsy translation, most speculatory with this translation of Foxy Noxy into Evil Knox, and okay, see you later, good evening, into see you really soon. Amanda Knox took the stand on June 12, 2009, a balmy summer day in Perugia. All around the place of justice, the media had held up radio vans. Photographers huddled by the front door, lined up in the hallways, spilled out of the dusty staircases and stood on plastic chairs in the frescoed courtroom, making sure that they got the best camera angles for the big event. As usual, many journalists showed up an hour early, leaned against the wooden rails, and talked to the family members and lawyers. Even prosecutor Giuliani Mangione had started coming out to talk to the reporters during the breaks. Giuliani Manini had started coming out to talk to reporters during the breaks. Amanda's not going to change up there on the stand, her aunt Christina Haggy told the journalist right before Amanda's testimony started. She likes her personality. She doesn't feel like she has to change herself and become a different person in court. Several days before this court appearance, Christina had visited Amanda in jail and marveled at her self-control. I thought I was going to see her fall apart, and when I said goodbye to her, but I felt good about it. She seemed very confident. After the rocky beginning, the Knox family had learned how to handle the press, mainly by making themselves accessible and freely giving out quotes. Kurt Knox in particular felt it was important to have somebody in court each day to combat whatever negative talking point the prosecution was putting out. The Italians noticed that the Knoxes never missed the visitor's day at Capini and never left Amanda alone in court. They found it touching and only right, no matter what their daughter may have done. We sent our daughter to study abroad, and now we're trying to bring her home. That's all we care about, Kurt would tell the press. He had traveled 6,000 miles simply to hear Amanda testify, as had his wife, Cassandra, a pleasant-faced blonde woman with blue eyes who reeled at the media onslaught, a new experience for her. I'm just going to stay as close to my husband as I can and help out whatever I can. Wherever I can, she said, and added that the two young daughters had trouble with the long separations from their father. He was one of the family members who had rotated in and out of Italy for a month at a time. Amanda's relatives took turns living in a drab apartment outside of Perugia so that Amanda would never be alone. It wasn't easy dealing with the enormous legal bills that now plagued them, which estimated at $1 million and climbing. Amanda was given $4 million for a book. They've been reimbursed. They're fine. She never paid back Rudy Goudet. All right. They had mortgaged both of their houses to pay for Amanda's defense, but Cassandra said it was a team effort. My girls are Amanda's sisters. We're doing this for her, and they know that. They are very close and always have been. The family's goal is to prop up Amanda to keep her optimistic. Although Giuliani Manini referred to the Knoxes as a clan, Kurt said that he wasn't interested in carrying out a vendetta. If Amanda can get her story across this time, then things will look up for her. If people can just go by what they hear in the court and not by what they are getting elsewhere, then she would have a chance at freedom. Jesus. Americans are so angry. Although nobody knew that the judges or jurors were what the judges or jurors were thinking, Kurt insisted that the defense was in a good position. They knocked down a lot of the evidence on cross-examination, even though the newspapers had not reported it. Instead, their stories focused on Amanda's looks and behavior, Court complained, calling her gleeful in court. If she smiled during those few minutes when she was allowed to greet her family. And in his opinion, the prosecutor's reliance on character assassination showed how weak the case was. He noted that not a single expert had ever been able to place Amanda in the murder room. No DNA, no blood, no skin cells of any type in the room where the murder occurred. Tell me how that's possible. You can't just clean up your own evidence. It can't just be done. Raffaelli's father, Francisco Solecito, also came to court nearly every day, often accompanied by a more charismatic of lawyers, Julia Bongorino, a member of parliament whose frenetic speech was constantly waving hands and had a calming effect on Raffaelli. Like Amanda, she was the bubbly type. Now, the 22-year-old Amanda had learned how to cut bella figura. In fact, Mal Ponte, a well-known Italian reporter, sometimes referred to as Amanda's third lawyer, would begin his coverage of her testimony with a fashion review. White blouse, beige trousers, flat shoes, a blue ribbon tied charmingly around her blonde ponytail. Amanda Knox comes dressed as a graduate student for what surely is the most awaited hearing in the trial. Ponte also pointed out that Amanda had put on a little weight, unlike Raffaelli, implying that she was the stronger of the two, able to even thrive on prison grub. Amanda faced an intimidating group of questioners, 2 judges, 2 prosecutors, Patrick Lumumba's bulldog lawyer, as well as the Kercher lawyers. In the stands were Monica Napoleoni, Rita Ficara, and other officers who had orchestrated her lawyer-free all-night interrogation. These officers came in and out continuously during Amanda's entire testimony, opening and closing the bronze doors, sitting at the table near the door, whispering to one another, making angry gestures. The brown-haired Ficara was the angriest, frowning and muttering under her breath when Amanda described being hit at the Cuestera. Judge Massey seemed to tip his hand towards the prosecution by announcing that Patrick Lumumba's very intimidating lawyer, Carlo Pichelli, would go first, a decision that caused a lot of chatter among the journalists. Pichelli, a beefy man with thick glasses and a tendency to smirk, had made no bones about detesting Amanda. As he stood outside the courthouse each day talking to the media on the steps, he was more than too happy to portray her as a promiscuous young woman who enjoyed telling lies. True story. Amanda faced Pichelli at the 2-person podium with an interpreter standing next to her. She looked both tense and self-confident, like a college student prepped for finals. Although she was well-groomed, she did have dark circles under her eyes and a cold sore on her lip. The reporters focused on this STD, which they took as a sign of her indulgence in sex. Pichelli smiled and wished the La Signoria Knox a good morning. He first questioned her about whether she'd known Rudy, and Amanda replied vaguely, and then told the now familiar story about how she'd been strolling in the old town when she saw Rudy with the boys from downstairs in the flat. They all saw Rudy with the boys. They all walked back to the cottage together. She spent most of the night with Meredith, but they were in the downstairs flat at some point. Was that the only time you saw Rudy? I think he might have come into Le Chic one time, she said indifferently. Pacelli then switched to the night when she had named Patrick, demanding to know why she did that. Unflappable, she simply took this as her cue to tell her story. When I went to the Questera that night, I didn't expect to be questioned, she said, beginning in English, but after a while, they took me into another interrogation room. She described the lengthy and intimidating questioning. Mamma mia, she said later, and then she switched into Italian, and then she demonstrated the rap she'd gotten on the back of the head. Who had done this to her? An officer with long chestnut hair? Amanda spoke for 5 hours without tears or drama. But was she telling the truth? As Mayo Ponte pointed out, the dependent upon whether you thought she was innocent like her father. I have never been more proud of her. Or whether you were her former flatmate, Filomena Romanelli, sitting unrecognizable in the front row, she had told Mao. She's inconsistent. She continues to change her stories. That is not how it went. Mao Ponte also pointed out, however, that the same story Amanda told in court could be found in a letter that she had sent her lawyer, Luciana Gregara, on November 9, 2007, a letter whose existence was a surprise to many reporters. Even more than Amanda's testimony, it filled in the dead air between 10:30 p.m. on November 5th, 2007, when the Seattle woman was just a 20-year-old college student doing her Italian language homework at 5:45 a.m. on November 6th, when she was a murder suspect carted off to prison with her alleged accomplice Raffaele and Patrick Lumumba. They told me that they already had arrested the murderer, Amanda wrote in English, and that they wanted me to say his name, but I knew nothing. An officer hit me twice in the head. My mind was searching for answers. I was really confused. I thought that I'd been at home with my boyfriend, but then what if it wasn't true? I tried and I couldn't remember anything until all the officers had left the room except one. She told me that there was only one means of avoiding spending the next 30 years in jail. I imagined that I'd met Patrick near the basketball courts. I imagined that I must have covered my ears so that I wouldn't hear the screams of Meredith. And then I named Patrick, and I totally regret it now because I know what I said has hurt him. As Douglas Preston commented later on The Observer, her original statements were written in Italian police parlance. There was no way for the American girl who'd been in Italy less than 2 months could possibly understand them. He contended that the Italian interrogators were extremely skilled, trained with dealing with the mafia, and the young foreign girl would be helpless against them. Amanda took to the stand again the next day, facing prosecutors Manini and Commodi. Again, she managed to get through without a breakdown. She did seem to forget one phone call that she had made to her mother on November 2nd, 2007, right before Meredith's body was uncovered. The prosecution made much of this non-existent phone call, despite the parade of police officers who hadn't been able to remember what time they'd gotten to the cottage the same day, who'd kept insisting that they hadn't looked at their watches or logged down the time and therefore couldn't be expected to be exact. Lawyers also questioned why Amanda had called her mother at such an early hour in Seattle. Why wake somebody up at 4 a.m. for a few drops of blood if you didn't know that there'd been a murder? Because I was worried, Amanda said. Conversely, she was also criticized for not having reacted quickly enough, for callously blow-drying her hair after seeing blood on the floor. The next week, Amanda's mother, Edna Mellis, took the stand, and Patrick's lawyer grilled her about the early calls. "She is my daughter," Edna explained. "Of course I want her to call me in a time of trouble. She can call me any time." Pacella also questioned her about the first visit with Amanda on November 10th. Why didn't she tell the world that her daughter had thought Patrick was innocent? Edna shook her head, looking bewildered. She'd been in a foreign country trying to deal with a daughter who had been thrown in prison. "I don't speak Italian," she finally said. After this testimony, Pacelli picked up his black briefcase and stormed out of the court. Andrew Saliber, who called himself Amanda's best friend, also testified on her behalf, having paid his own way from Seattle for this purpose. "Can you tell us about Amanda's sex life in Seattle?" asked Francisco Maresca, the lawyer of the Kerchers. "No." Maresca was introduced into the court on record as a sign of Amanda's debauchery, the noise violation ticket she'd gotten for hosting a loud going-away party in Seattle. Surprisingly, Judge Massey even allowed Maresca to introduce into evidence the baseless story that had run in the Daily Mail that erroneously described the party as a street riot and portrayed Amanda as a girl gone wild. The defense objected strenuously, while the lawyers yelled all around him. Andrew waited patiently and then explained that the citation was similar to a traffic ticket and, in fact, logged in the same form. "It was just a party, a leaf thin," Andrew said gently, "a college party." He explained that he had been at fault because it was his band that had performed at the house. Amanda had gone to the door when the police arrived because she was the most sober person there. The Daily Mail provided the rare moment of unconscious humor when the notorious tabloid shamelessly took Amanda's younger sister, Deanna Knox, to task for wearing shorts and a t-shirt ensemble in the colors of the American flag on the 4th of July. She had just been trying to cheer Amanda up, Deanna said, and it wasn't like anyone was going to let Amanda out to celebrate Americans' liberation from the British, even more desirable than when the Daily Mail went after a family member. The tabloid had managed to steeplechase over the competition, even when it came to raunchy stories about the Kercher case, including Meredith, 2-month relationship with secret boyfriend. Strands of hair in hands of murdered Meredith could belong to her killer. Amanda Knox behind the Hollywood smile, a liar, a narcissist, and a killer. The wild, raunchy past of Foxy Knoxy, flatmate inside the twisted world of a flatmate, suspected of Meredith's murder. "I'm confused about who cut Meredith's throat," says Foxy Knoxy in new plea deal. The Daily Mail had also scolded Deanna and her sister Ashley in the same melodramatic story, revealing Foxy Knoxy's sisters posting happily for macabre photos in house where Kercher died, for posing in front of the House of Horrors, again in shorts and a far more respectable gente, the Italian version of People magazine. Far from looking happy, the girls appeared tense and miserable in their photos, their arms wound around each other for comfort. Moreover, the Daily Mail hadn't been shocked when the jurors in the Meredith Kercher case had smiled and chatted on the very threshold of the House of Horrors during an official visit on April 18, 2009. The juries weren't standing on the road like the Knox girls, but actually preparing to go inside to see the room where Meredith's throat was cut. So the Knox family is just completely inappropriate. A bunch of fucking creeps. Cool. Yeah, there's a difference between a jury going into a crime scene and a weirdo family using a house as a prop. Police have done a poor job of safeguarding the premises during the 2 years that the cottage had been roped off as a crime scene. In fact, the year vandals had burglarized it several times, each time breaching the windows. And if to taunt a prosecutor known for his satanic murder theories, the intruders had created a sort of shrine in one room, lighting candles and arranging knives all around to suggest some sort of occult ritual. On the most recent visit, intruders had even stolen Meredith Kercher's mattress, the one in which her purse had been resting on the night of the murder. On August 27, 2009, the court unsealed the House of Horrors, it no longer a crime scene. The owners installed new locks on every door, put grills over the windows, and renovated it from top to bottom. In the fall, she would rent it out to a bunch of foreigners. Like the prosecution, the defense presented many excerpts, but without the timing and stagecraft for which Manini was known. As one family member said, they had to present the experts when they were available, not when it made thematic sense. Some hearings were jammed, such as those featuring the famous forensic expert Carlo Torre and Dr. Sarah Gino, a DNA expert who had annoyed prosecutor Manuela Comodi by attacking the scanty DNA samples used to implicate the suspects. Other hearings were nearly empty, and the jurors openly suffered from what journalists called migo, my eyes glaze over. One gray-haired juror wearing an Italian tricolored sash napped through many afternoons. Prosecutor Manini also slumbered occasionally, although his abuse of office trial in Florence had wrapped up. He was now awaiting the verdict. It kept getting pushed back. The jurors did seem to enjoy anyone who came to the exhibits, such as the distinguished forensic expert Francisco Intorno, who brought in a blonde mannequin's head into which he inserted a Swiss knife to demonstrate that the kitchen knife was too large to have been a murder weapon. He believed that Meredith had died around 9:30 p.m., as Frank Sfarzo described in Toronto's theory of the crime. A hostile presence in this house, a lonely presence. Meredith is naked from the waist down. He reaches her at the end of her room. He grabs her from behind. He lifts her t-shirts she wears. He then blocks her mouth and nose, a gesture that wants to mean, don't worry, do what I want and I won't do anything to you. He grabs her bra and cuts it off with a knife. He pushes her down to her knees in order to rape her. But then here something happens, and the will of the possession becomes the will of killing. Staying still behind her, he puts the blade on her face. Then he grabs her at the jaw and he sticks the blade completely into her throat. One time and a second time right after, Meredith falls over on her back. He gets on top of her. While she lies bleeding and trying to breathe, he takes her bra away. She will bleed to death in 10 minutes, suffocated by her own blood. Although this scenario was certainly a common one, when Interno brought in two women to act out the murder, a jury to the left of the judge burst out laughing. The famous forensic expert Carlo Torre, the professional type with unruly silver hair, also testified for Amanda's team. He scoffed at the two-knife theory, saying that it would be the first time in history that a murder was carried out that way. He also used styrofoam heads to demonstrate that the knife the kitchen knife was too large and had made 2 smaller wounds. Everything leads me to believe that is not the murder weapon, he said. Raffaelli's team, meanwhile, tried to shore up his computer alibi with the assistance from Raffaelli himself, who followed the court case carefully. His team also went after Rudy Goudet as the lone killer, while the prosecution, now that he was safely served a life sentence, all of a sudden made him sound out to be a mere spectator. Raffaelli's team did all they could to show that Rudy had a criminal past. They brought in witnesses who described his arrest in the nursery school in Milan and the alleged second-story window break-in at a lawyer's office in Perugia. They also had a deposition from a bartender in Merlin's who claimed that Rudy Goudet had climbed through a window of his apartment one night armed with a knife and stole credit cards and cash before the bartender chased him out the front door. The defense never let the juries forget Rudy's modus operandi. It was textbook reflection for the Kercher case, they claimed. He had entered through the windows. He had carried a knife. He allegedly stole cell phones. The problem for the defense, which had managed to get Rudy's alibi testimony kept out of court, was that the prosecution steadily benefited from the judicial sleight of hand. Rudy Goudet's appeal was supposed to begin in November and last only a few days. Since he had chosen the fast-track abbreviated trial, the trials were never open to the public except in this case. The trial judge granted Rudy's unprecedented permission to let the public and the cameras in, meaning that the unsequestered jury would now hear him claim that Amanda and Meredith fought all the time and that the American girl had been at the crime scene. But there was a cause for hope. Certainly the prosecution would have a hard time hanging the theft charge on the couple, since it turned out neither had been caught with the money. Rudy had been acquitted for similar reasons, even though Manini finally admitted in Ogi. Rudy rummaged through the purse. The judge, Paoli Michelli, had absolved him of theft. But the greatest drama circled around the DNA on the bra clasp and the knife. When Patrizia Stefani, had previously unflappable scientist who'd performed the DNA test, couldn't say exactly how much DNA she had found on either item, the judge closed down the proceedings. He ordered that she produce all of the paperwork concerning the DNA results to the defense by July. Then the court went into recess until September. When the trial resumed in the fall, Manuela Commodi brought in the knife that had been taken from Raffaelli's kitchen, the one with the disputed DNA evidence on it. The defense experts hadn't been allowed to handle it, only look at the knife from afar. It arrived with its own armed guard, wrapped in plastic like a rose, and displayed on a cardboard pizza-like box stamped "Handle with care" in English. But the defense claimed that the proper paperwork still hadn't materialized. The defense side nearly ended in triumph when it brought in 3 neutral witnesses that Judge Claudia Mattinelli had chosen long ago to take a second look at the Lawley autopsy report. They agreed with Lawley's conclusions, it turned out. They were not able to prove that the victim had been raped, nor did they see the signs of group attack. Nor did they contend that she had died a long, lingering death, which would have been useful for the prosecution because it would have meant that the alibis had been lengthened. In fact, they said that Meredith had probably died within 10 minutes of the attack, and judging by the mysterious cell phone call to her bank, they would place the time of the attack around 10 p.m., going by her stomach contents. They could conclude that it happened before 11 p.m. The defense then asked Judge Massey to appoint neutral experts common in Italian trials to look at the disputed evidence, including Raffaelli's computer and the DNA. In another ongoing murder trial at this time, Alberto Stalzi, accused of murdering his girlfriend Chiara Poggi in a sensational case, had been saved at the last minute from defeat by a judge who said he didn't buy the computer and footprint evidence. Like Giuliani Menini, the prosecutor in the case had based his argument on a quarrel which no one else had witnessed. Stasi had been looking at pornography on his computer, and the prosecutor declared that Poggi had caught him at the threat and threatened to expose him. The judge scoffed. "Pure invention," he said, and then he set Stasi free. In contrast, on October 9, 2009, Judge Massey delivered a hard blow to Amanda and Raffaelli. He refused to appoint neutral experts to view any of the evidence. "We have all the evidence we need," he said, and even though the only expert who ever reviewed Stefani's use of low-copy DNA was her own boss, called to court during the pretrial to say that everything was perfect. Amanda put her head down when she heard this news. Raffaelli appeared shaken. The defense team tried in vain to spin this refusal as positive development. The neutral experts had now testified. The defense lawyers reminded the press, the ones appointed by Judge Mantieni, and then they cast doubt on 6.5-inch kitchen knife supposedly used to murder Meredith. Forensic experts Mariani Kingaloni said that it was too large to have caused one of the smaller wounds and that many knives were more compatible with that kind of wound. So there was hope. Soon an international group of top-flight scientists would meet in Las Vegas and devote an entire session to the use of controversial DNA on the knife and the broad clasp in the Kercher murder case. Later, after several scientists reviewed the prosecutors used to identify the DNA, they drafted a letter of concern and released it to the media on November 19, 2009. It was signed by two very well-respected scientists, Elizabeth A. Johnson, Ph.D., and Greg Hampikatan, Ph.D. from Idaho. The DNA on the knife, they pointed out, had tested negatively for blood. Amanda's DNA on the handle was of no consequence because she cooked in Raffaelli's kitchen. Since the knife was tested in a lab where numerous samples of Meredith's DNA had been taken, there exists a real possibility that the low-level partial profile attributed to the knife blade is a result of unintended transfer in the laboratory during the sample handling. In short, they said, no credible scientific evidence had been presented to link the knife to Meredith's murder. Then the same scientists looked up the bra clasp. They noted that it had been found under a disheveled rug 47 days after the murder, not in its original place under the victim. They pointed out that no DNA of Raffaelli's appeared on the actual bra, which did bear traces of Rudy Gaday's. Moreover, there was no way to date the DNA, and since Raffaelli was a visitor in the home, he could have left with his traces from before the crime, and there was no way to tell. Their dedication, the DNA test results described above could have been obtained even if no crime had occurred. As such, they do not constitute credible evidence that linked Amanda Knox and Raffaele Slecito to the murder of Meredith Kercher. Chapter 20, Closing Arguments and Verdict, a very public stoning, November 20th, December 4th, 2009. The lack of evidence is both compelling and profound. Criminal lawyer Theodore Simon on Good Morning America. Amanda is the Amelie of Seattle, a girl who looks at people through the eyes of a child, bursting with energy and has spontaneous or recklessness approach to life. That was the attorney of Raffaele Sledgetoe. Closing arguments in the Hall of Forensics had a grandeur that the rest of the trial had lacked. For all its Kafkaesque Oh my god, I'm so tired of being in this book. Twists and turns. After 11 months and 140 witnesses, it all came down to this. Daily hearings at last from November 20th to December 4th, skipping only one Sunday. After which Judge Giancarlo Miassi would come out of his chambers, face the defendants, and read the verdict. Judgment Day seemed real, everything racing swiftly towards the final words. Had the police officers really come to court to complain about Amanda's splits and cartwheels? Did she really wear the All You Need Is Love t-shirt on Valentine's Day? All that seemed so long and far away. So long ago and far away. Like the time that prosecutor Commodi couldn't get a crime scene video to run on her laptop. Murder suspect Raffaele Sledgetoe had jumped up to help her, even though she was trying to convince the jurors that forensic police had carefully handled the broad clasp that allegedly tied him to the crime. In the courtroom now, even in a moment like that, seemed impossibly playful. The mood was somber as judge and jurors faced the grand finale. Amanda often showed up in the light pink cardigan and with the Beatles insignia on the back, but her smiles came less frequently, and she often turned her face to the side to hide. Raffaele looked paler and thinner by the day. The relatives weren't allowed to speak to them, and they were never alone in court. Amanda's relatives arrived in mass. Edna and Chris Mellis, Kurt and Cassandra Knox, Aunt Krista and Sister Deanna. Her two younger sisters, Delaney and Ashley, were too young to get into the hearings, but were permitted to wait in the antechamber behind the big bronze doors to the left of the room, where they could shout out greetings to Amanda as the guards escorted her in and out. Raffaele Sledgetoe's sister, Vanessa, and Father Francisco and stepmother Mara also came to court. Reporters knew that the names and faces of all the relatives by now. In fact, the whole courtroom was like a big dysfunctional family brought together for the finish. Amanda's family had bought her plane ticket to Seattle, hoping she'd get to use it, a move that certain members of the Fourth Estate found presumptuous. Raffaele's family scarcely needed such elaborate plans, but they also dreamed of taking him home. Often Vanessa and Francesca would sit in the row behind him, peeking at him over their computers, hoping that they could at least look him in the eyes when he turned around. Now and then he would turn to look at Amanda or smile at the Knoxes. His stepmother Mara came less frequently, and when she did, she seemed agitated, unable to listen anymore, reluctant to sit down. Vanessa, too, had her difficulties. She said she was no longer in the Cabinari because the name Sledgetoe had won her no friends. Prosecutor Giuliani Manini's closing argument would be remembered for its brutality. He was the first to speak on November 20th, 2009, and he harangued the defendants for 8 hours. Amanda Knox, he kept saying, "Amanda Knox!" She did everything. Rudy Goudet wanted to please Amanda. So did Raffaele Slegito. They would have done anything for her. It turned out that the prosecutor had not changed his vision of the crime. Meredith was killed while resisting an orgy since November 2007, even though coroner Luca Lally and the 3 independent court-appointed experts had all said that they could not prove sexual assault or group attack. Nor did they buy into the prosecutor's two-knife theory. It wasn't them that Manini had to convince, though, but the 2 judges and the jurors. He told them that Amanda had been in the center, and Patrick texted her on November 1st and told her not to come to work. She was maybe looking around for a bit of fun because Raffaele was busy, having promised to drive Giovanna Popovic to the bus station at midnight. By chance, Amanda saw Rudy on his way to meet Meredith, and Amanda made some kind of appointment with him for later. She then decided to go see Raffaele, conveniently arriving just in time to speak to Giovanna at 8:45 p.m. Learning that Raffaele no longer needed to drive Giovanna to the station, Amanda convinced him to come with her on Rudy's date, or whatever it was. They headed to Piazza Gramana, where Toto saw them. Finally, Rudy showed up, and they all went into the cottage together, Raffaele with some reluctance. When Amanda let the 2 men in, Meredith was already there. Probably a savage quarrel broke out. Maybe over the missing rent money, or the toilet flushing, or Rudy's presence in the house. Amanda hated Meredith. Probably she had meant to kill her on Halloween, hence the seemingly innocent text messages, "Do you have a costume, and do you want to meet up later?" Amanda was tired of the British girl's complaint, Manini said, his voice rising and falling, becoming thunderous. He claimed that Amanda and the 2 men were in a drugged-up rage and eager for a 4-way sex scene. Only Meredith thought that this was a bad idea. Amanda had brought a knife along from Raffaele's apartment just in case the roommate resisted. After a heated discussion, the 3, under the influence of drugs and probably alcohol as well, decided to put into action the plan they had to involve her in an extreme sex game, Manini told the court. He even provided dialogue for Amanda. "You little saint, I'm going to teach you a lesson. You're going to have sex with us." Manini described an overwrought Amanda, one who bore little resemblance to the laid-back neo-hippie from Seattle, a place where people prided themselves on their tolerance and calm. The 3 accused killers were like unleashed furies, Manini said. Raffaele flashed the small knife, Amanda the great big one. Raffaele tried to force off Meredith's bra, somehow only touching the metal clasp, while Rudy tried to rape Meredith as she screamed. Amanda slashed her roommate's throat, and then they all fled. Rudy going one way, Raffaele and Amanda the other. Rudy went dancing at Domas while the couples waited until they could make sure nobody was around to call the cops, and then they returned to break the window, simulating a robbery and cleaning up all traces of themselves. After the enduring of the prosecutor's wrath, Amanda Knox collapsed in her lawyer's arms and had to be taken out of the courtroom. Frank Sforza captured the ordeal in Perugia shock. The voice is harsh, the voice is loud, and keeps accusing her while 1,000 eyes study all her reactions like a guinea pig in a cage. That voice full of hate continued to yell, ruthless, and seems to convince everybody. It seems to convince these 6 strangers who stare at her silent, the judge that will have to decide her life. If she smiles, it's wrong. If she cries, it's wrong. If she moves, it's wrong. And if she's still, it's wrong. If she watches, it's wrong. And if she doesn't watch, it's wrong. When Amanda returned, Manini continued and continued. For proof for all the above had occurred, Manini cited the broken window, which he insisted was a staging. For proof of that, he made the old claim that a burglar would have to scale 20 feet to get inside, instead of climbing up the little grate below the window and using a planter box near the front door of the ledge. He claimed that the rock would have been thrown from a great distance instead of from a parapet, a claim that Judge Michelli had chided him for in the pretrial. The next day, co-prosecutor Manuela Comodi went over the DNA, and the jurors looked nearly as bored as the reporters. But then Manini, with his usual sense of timing, sprung the surprise he'd been promising. The prosecution showed a 25-minute video reimagining of the crime, using cartoon characters as stand-ins for the three suspects, the three pigs prosecutor Comodi called them. With the suspects' real faces stuck to the bodies, the video showed Rudy, Raffaele, and Amanda arriving together at the cottage, pictured them teasing and taunting Meredith with the kitchen knife, and ending in a sea of red blood. When Amanda struck the final blow, most disturbingly, the film used real crime scene footage and the graphic images of Meredith's body to tell the tale, even though reporters had previously been forced to leave the courtroom whenever such images were introduced into court. The real Amanda turned her head. She could not look at the video. The film was based on little more than theory, with almost no forensic evidence to support it, but more than one observer said that it had a hypnotic effect. The video was aimed, reporters believed, not at the judges, but at the board-laid jurors, such as the silver-haired man who had continued his habit of sleeping through the defense testimony. Once the prosecutors finished, the civil plaintiffs took their turn. Francesco Maresca, the Kercher's lawyer, used his time to contrast the reserved Kerchers with the in-your-face Knoxes, although their situations and thus tactics could not have been more different. He called the prosecution case logico and hammered Raffaele in particular for inconsistencies in his story. Patrick Lamamba's pitbull lawyer, Carla Picelli, was just as brutal as Manini, a balding, overweight man, tall and intimidating. He delighted in showing Amanda's confession thrown out by the Supreme Court, but brought into court via Patrick's civil lawsuit. He kept putting it on the screen, the key sections outlined by a magic marker. He yelled at Amanda for several hours, angering many females in the courtroom by calling her a typical woman, depraved, scheming, murderous. She lies in blatant and a shameless manner, he said. He claimed that Amanda had named Patrick in her confession because she thought his bar was closed that night and he would not have an alibi. He also berated the American girl who showed and washed her hair far too often for the two judges for poor hygiene. The Vanna Ugoloni of Il Messaggero, that was finally too much. She pointed out that Picelli had exaggerated when he called Amanda a shameless liar, and wondered aloud why so many people felt that they could pass judgment on private matters unrelated to the crime. In her beauty case, she had condoms, sharing that it is hardly a crime. In fact, it is in line with the Ministry of Health directives, just as it is not a crime to have romantic or even purely sexual involvements. This doesn't make Amanda Knox an explosive mix of sex, drugs, and bad hygiene. Then the bad hygiene the lawyer was probably referring to was her roommate's complaints that Amanda left the bathroom messy. Ugoloni also objected to the stereotypes on which the entire case framed. "Give me a break," she wrote. "Saint or prostitute, witch or Snow White, Cinderella or stepmother, for women, no third possibilities seem to have been invited. Where is the in-between? Where was normal life?" No one could blame jurors for nodding off when Raffaele's lawyer, Lucia Morali, got up to read, and read and read. He droned on for more than 250 pages of testimony. Even the Italian reporters found his words hard to swallow, just constant drip, drip, drip of convoluted phrases. Rudy Guede was the name most often on Maury's tongue. His presentation was only alive only after he played recorded excerpts from the convicted murderer, whose thick Umbrian accent was startling. As other defense lawyers pointed out, Rudy Guede had had knife cuts on his hands. He'd left his DNA inside the victim, on her purse, on her jacket, and in a larger bedroom, on the toilet paper, on the floor, everywhere. Yet the prosecution was now presenting him as a mere spectator, yet another pawn in Amanda's game. Amanda's lawyer, Carla Dalla Vedova, complained that the police had questioned his client for more than 40 hours before her arrest and said that since November 6th, 2 years ago, a huge wave, a tsunami, has swept up Amanda Knox, a girl of soap and water, i.e. an innocent. Her other lawyer, Luciana Gregara, who had been lackluster in cross-examination, suddenly sparkled. As for the controversial lack of tears, why was only Amanda required to cry publicly? What was wrong with her eating pizza or kissing her boyfriend? What did any of that have to do with murder? The fiery Giuliana Bongorino, one of Raffaelli's lawyers, mesmerized the courtroom with a spirited arm-wave defense of both defendants. "I'm here to impress you, not the other lawyers," she told the judges and the jurors. Clad in a black robe and running shoes, she said that Amanda was like Amelie of Seattle, a reference of a doe-eyed heroine of Amanda's favorite film, and the one that she and Raffaelli had been watching the night of the murder. Amanda's friends think that she's like Amelie because she likes the little things like birds singing. I agree with Amanda's friends. Amanda looks at the world through Amelia's eyes. She is spontaneous, immediate. But Bongiorni also called Amanda fragile and weak, a little bizarre and naive, as a way to explain the behavior the prosecution had called cold and uncaring. Cartwheels in the police station, for instance. She's extravagant and unusual, full of contradictions. Amanda's third lawyer, Maria Del Grosso, took Giuliani Menini to task for his ideas about women, their supposedly manipulative nature, their presumed power over men. She criticized the prosecution for working sex into everything, falsely portraying Amanda as a promiscuous young woman who endangered Meredith by bringing home strange men, when in fact she had a lover in her bedroom only once, and Meredith had been in Guacamole's room that night. The testimony ended the day of rebuttals, in which the lawyers simply repeated their former arguments with less heat and far shorter length. Manuela Cambodi played solitaire on her computer and stared at her frosted nails when she wasn't on the podium. She made a valiant attempt to prove that Raffaelli couldn't possibly have called the cops before the postal police arrived, using long, dull lists of numbers put up on a screen. But in the end, the trial of the century was like a police property room, where everyone could rummage through the contents, picking out what they needed to prove any theory. PowerPoint presentations, blood samples, telephone records, it all became a blur. Meanwhile, reporters noticed as the trial wound down that Amanda looked more and more upset and also more pulled together in appearance. She wore her hair up in a French braid and showed up each day in a green wool jacket over a pretty blouse and slacks. She's dressed now as she would have dressed in the beginning, said Richard Owens of the Times. The last day of court, Raffaele Slegito faced the judges and the jurors, looking fragile in a white turtleneck and khaki pants. He nevertheless rose from his chair and spoke to them in a soft, firm voice, pleading his case, as Frank Sforza wrote on Perugia Shock. Raffaelli, with big emotion, took the stand. He maintained his innocence. He even defended his image. Me, dependent on Amanda? Me, on a leash? If someone asked me to do something I don't want to do, I just say no. Imagine if they told me to kill a girl, said the Puglian boy, added that he would never do it. As for Amanda killing Meredith over complaints over impure hygiene, he called it an absurd story. Amanda also spoke to the court in Italian. Her voice shook so badly that the judge interrupted her and asked if she wanted to switch to English. She said, "No. In these situations, I breathe and I try to find the positive," she said. Then she rambled, saying that people had been asking her how she could stay so calm, and that in her situation they would have been torn their hair out and destroyed the jail cell. But Amanda insisted that she didn't feel calm. She felt scared, especially being labeled something she was not. "I am afraid. I have a mask of a murderer forced upon my skin." "Now the decision will be made," she told the court. "In front of you, I feel vulnerable." She thanked her friends and family for support, her lawyers, and bizarrely even the prosecutors, for doing their jobs even if they don't understand. They are trying to bring justice to a person who has been taken from the world. Then she put her head down and rushed out of the courtroom, accompanied by 2 guards. She had tears running down her face, said her sister Deanna Knox, who mouthed, "I love you," as Amanda walked by. I knew she was horribly upset. She doesn't like it, sitting there and hearing terrible things about herself. She keeps it all inside, but I can tell. Coraline Kelly, a tall American college student with long hair parted down the middle, was staring at Deanna, who was visibly shaking. "I'm trying to send a nod of encouragement to her," said Caroline. She and another girl named Caroline Doyle, a small blonde who had also been hoping to give Amanda's family some encouragement, had come to court with a small group of American female students from the American-run Umbria Institute, which had only about 80 students enrolled in Perugia that fall. They were very different from the other American college students who had shown up occasionally during the trial. The girls who had come earlier especially had been proud to say that they didn't empathize with Amanda, even though they were the same age and nationality. "Maybe she did it," they said. "We don't know." They refused to identify with her. They were not like that. "That's because everyone thought Amanda did it," said Caroline Doyle, when asked why the American student had been so unsympathetic. The other Caroline, the smaller blonde, said that she was writing a paper on the case and had gradually become convinced of the UW student's innocence. "The proof isn't there. There is no way you can look at the facts and come to any other conclusion." Prosecutor Giuliani Manini hurriedly left the room right after Amanda. Delaney Knox, Amanda's 11-year-old sister, was standing on the other side of the bronze door when he came through and went down the hall. He was crying, she said. The next day, Manini let it be known that he had not wept after seeing Amanda Knox plead for her freedom. "Absolutely not," he insisted. "It wasn't true." Cool Knox family. He'd merely felt hot and gone into the bathroom to dab water on his face. That accounted for the moisture, he said. If Manini wept for Amanda, then he must have cried crocodile tears. He and Manuela Cambodi ended the prosecution case the same day. They asked the court for the highest possible penalty, life imprisonment, based on counts of murder and sexual violence. Life meant 30 years, the same sentence given to Rudy Gaudet, but Manini felt that Amanda deserved more. He wanted the 22-year-old American to endure 9 months of solitary confinement. Ogie magazine told Manini's final argument as high-performance art. A little Mr. Hyde and a little Dr. Jekyll, Giuliani Manini is a character sometimes disturbing, sometimes very pleasant, a good conversationalist, a man of great culture, fond of jokes, good Umbrian cuisine, and beautiful things in general. He is what is known as a nice guy, but in the courtroom, with his gown over his shoulders before the bench, his features almost change, his words become stones thrown with violence. His toughness borders on fury. Amanda is a witch. She hated Meredith, prissy as she hated anyone who wanted to steal her limelight. When she killed, she was compressed, a spring ready to explode, he said with a voice reverberating in disdain. The lawyer takes over from the man in me, he explains. Therefore, he does not consider life imprisonment sufficient and also asked for solitary confinement. The jury deliberated for 12 hours the next day. It was just after midnight when they announced their decision on December 4th, 2009. Reporters had to fight through the darkness, while throngs of young people created a mob scene around the front door. Even the families of the suspects had to fight their way in, with the Knoxes being forced to go around the building to find a back entrance. It was packed hot and dark in the courtroom, and the air seemed to give off sparks. So many people had crowded in that it was difficult to see all the jurors. Amanda was the easiest to spot because she wore a bright green jacket. As Judge Massey announced the verdict, her shoulders slumped. She leaned against her attorney and sobbed. "No! No!" Raffaelli's stepmother screamed and screamed, shouting, "Rosa!" Strength. He didn't react. He was numb, disbelieving, and later said, the Knox women started to sob. "Condemned!" Frank Savarzo said, shaking his head. "How can you condemn somebody without proof? There's no proof." It was startling to see the one juror, the silver-haired man who had always been asleep up on his feet, staring in Amanda's direction, alert for once. Judge Massey never looked up. He kept reading in an expressionless way, in a hypnotic rhythm, like a Gregorian chant. Amanda, central to the crime, got 26 years, Raffaelli 25 for the murder and sexual assault. They were convicted of every charge except theft, in which the court hadn't been able to pin on Rudy Godet either. The pair was also told to pay the total of amount of $7.5 million to the Kercher family. Yeah, Amanda didn't pay them either. To this day, 2025, Amanda hasn't paid nobody shit. Can you imagine being that awful? The pair was also told to pay a total of $7.4 million to the Kercher family. Amanda, in addition, had to pay $60,000 to Patrick Lumumba. Raffaelli stayed stoic. Amanda continued to lean against her lawyer and sob. "No, no," she said. Deanna Knox burst into tears. So did other women, like Raffaelli's stepmother. "We bought her plane tickets. Do you understand? She's going home with us," Cassandra Knox said in the courtroom after Judge Massey finished reading the verdict in a monotone. "Don't ask me what I think of it. You don't want to know. Devastated is the right word. I can think of a lot of stronger words, but I don't want to say them." "There will be an appeal," the British journalist told her. "She has a good chance of getting out." "An appeal? Are you kidding me?" Cassandra said. "Here in Perugia, it'll be the same thing over and over again. They're never going to give her a chance." Amanda Knox is fine. Ugh, Jesus. I'm so tired of being here. Ugh. "An appeal? Are you kidding me?" Cassandra said. In Perugia, it will be the same thing over and over again. They're never going to give her a chance. Then, quickly as it began, the drama was over. The guards rushed the defendants out of the courtroom. Their family members hurried around, although they could only shout out, "I love you." They weren't allowed to speak to the convicted murderers. On the other side of the door stood brown-haired Rita Ficara and Lorena Zugarini, the two officers who had interrogated Amanda all night on November 5-6, 2007. In for the kill, as one reporter put it. The Kerchers waited there too, in that little antechamber. As Frank Safarzo wrote shortly after he left the courtroom that painful night, it was their revenge on those they think killed their angel, looking at them in the moment of their desperation while they were brought to jail, now officially murderers. The moment long awaited since the day the Kerchers must have asked their lawyer, did they really do it? And he must have answered yes. Revenge passed the door, satisfaction in the courtroom too, with Manini seeming to enjoy the view of relatives. Piety takes possession of the proceedings, while Amanda and Raffaele disappear in the darkness. Outside, an actual merry-go-round had been set up for some unrelated celebration, adding to the carnival atmosphere. Italian students with beers in hands hovering the TV vans, watching reporters do their setups. Silver Christmas trees glowed over the alleyways all across town. A much larger group of young Italians had gathered on the cobblestones slightly uphill from the courthouse and right outside the bubble. They applauded the verdict, bustling into cheers. They watched Kurt Knox fight his way out of the courthouse, pulling his little blonde daughters through the crowd. "Assassin! Assassin!" shouted a drunk. Kurt picked up his pace. Photographers chased him and the girls across the Corso, all the way to the Buffonelli Hotel on Piazza Italia, past which Perugia ends in a steep cliff that drops down into the valley. Inside the posh Buffonelli, the rest of the family had gathered. All the women were crying. Kurt Knox and Chris Mellis drove the others back to their apartments outside and dropped them off. But the men found themselves restless, unable to sleep. So then they returned to the Buffonelli, where ABC and other networks had set up their cameras. Chris and Kurt gave countless interviews, tapping into TV networks all over the world, staying in the hotel until dawn. News reporters were beaming back to Seattle, where DJ and other friends of Amanda were gathering around a TV at her grandmother's house. When the verdict hit the airwaves, they had covered their faces, sobbed, and shook their heads in disbelief. Later, they felt shock, nausea, disbelief. Madison Paxton told the Today Show that she was stunned because she believed the court would have made the decision based on forensic evidence, not on a psychoanalysis of Amanda's character, especially her so-called promiscuity. Whether she had no sex or a lot of sex is completely irrelevant. It's basically a witch hunt where they're taking this woman, and she's a young, educated woman, having sex, and it's, oh my goodness, that better not be someone's daughter doing this, so we're going to make an example of her. Kurt Knox and Edna Mellis released a statement saying, "While we were always knew that this was a possibility, we will find it difficult to accept this verdict when we know that she is innocent. The prosecution has failed to explain why there is no evidence of Amanda in the room where Meredith was so horribly and tragically murdered. They blame the press. It appears clear to us that the attacks on Amanda's character in much of the media and by the prosecution had a significant impact on the judges and the jurors and apparently overshadowed the lack of evidence in the prosecution's case against her. Photographers had captured one last iconic image of Amanda Knox that dark December night. She was being held in the police van outside the courthouse, waiting for guards to take her inside, where the black-robed judge would read her fate. The camera caught her in the last moment of innocence, an American college student gazing through the barred window of an Italian police van before she knew the verdict would go against her, before she heard the word condemned. Amanda had a sweet face, dominated by powerful blue eyes. It was the kind of face upon many stories could be written. That was her fate. Afterward, buyer's remorse worldwide, December 5th, 2009, January 22nd, 2010. They convicted Foxy Knoxy. That's not Amanda. Ugh. They convicted Foxy Knoxy. That's not Amanda. I should be trusting, but it is very difficult. My world collapsed around me with that verdict. It collapsed around me and Amanda. Raffaele Slecito till il messaggero. Prison guards carrying bronze keys on a big ring locked Amanda and Raffaele into their cells, and then they put them on suicide watch. The Italian boy vanished into a world of his own, frightened and confused and fragile. In the days leading up to the verdict, he had expressed a longing to be anonymous. He said that if police had caught Rudy Gudet before he'd fled to Germany, then the world would have never have heard Amanda Knox or of Raffaele Slecito. Amanda felt horrendous after the verdict, but her cellmates waited for her, gave her warm milk, and sat with her while she sobbed through the night. Non faire così, Bambi. The prison official reportedly told her, "Don't carry on like that." Reverend Saul Scarabatello told reporters that the Seattle girl had maintained a positive attitude throughout the trial, but as the verdict neared, she acted like a person awaiting the axe. Still, she never wavered on from the point that she was innocent. "I believe that she had nothing to do with what happened, about what went on that day. I really don't know," he said. Added that he had met Amanda in prison 2 years before. "I can tell you that she's not a witch." The morning after the verdict, prison guards allowed the Knox family a quick visit with Amanda. Afterward, Edna Kurt and Amanda's 3 sisters faced the TV cameras in a Capini parking lot, looking chilled and exhausted. Ashley and Delaney clung to Deanna, the older sister, a tall girl in a black down jacket who had dropped off out of college because she was having trouble coping with her sister's incarceration. Even before the closing arguments began, Deanna said her hair had started falling out. Amanda, the oldest sister, was the only one missing from the picture frame. The Knoxes had planned to celebrate her release by taking a photo of all the 4 girls together. They wanted to bring Amanda back to the United States for Christmas, everybody on the same plane, sitting side by side. They had all tried to believe that the fantasy during trial with varying degrees of success. "You bet there's going to be an appeal," Kurt now told the reporters. Indeed, appeals were automatic in the Italian court system. If Amanda failed to win the first appeal, then she could take her case to the Supreme Court of Italy, the highest in the land. "We told our daughter to be strong," Edna said, wrapping her bright blue coat around her. "We said, don't give up. It's just going to take a little bit longer and you're going to get out of here." She and Kurt praised the guards for helping their daughter deal with the verdict. Edna insisted that many people at the prison thought Amanda was innocent, hence the nickname Bambi. Before the appeal could be launched, the Knoxes would need to wait for the judge's report, due to come out about 3 months later, which outlined the reasoning behind the verdict. In the meantime, American journalist Judy Bacharach, a contributing editor for Vanity Fair who had written one of the Amanda Knox stories, was cautiously optimistic. There's a possibility if Italy is ashamed enough, she might win an appeal, but it takes a lot of influence and a lot of clout. A lot of work, I'm afraid, she told Good Morning America. She also said several jurors had decided to vote guilty 2 weeks before the verdict. Other reporters had talked to a juror who had complained about how hard it was for the jurors to have the defendants in front of them all those months, knowing what they had done to Meredith. In fact, it turned out that the jurors had considerably only two options: life imprisonment, 30 years, or the lesser sentence that took into account the young age of the defendants. An unnamed juror told ABC News that that was an agonizing decision and that they had all had trouble sleeping the night before. This jury had then provided a new standard for beyond a reasonable doubt it's possible. It's hard to envision Amanda Knox doing this, but it is possible. We can all drink too much and we get into a car and drive. The statement stunned a Seattle lawyer. The fallacy is that driving is something that you can do on a normal basis, and sure, it's dangerous while you're drunk. You might hurt somebody, but you would never kill anybody even while drunk unless you are a depraved person. Drunk drivers kill people all the fucking time. Whatever. And who'd said the suspects were drunk? Only Menini, tossing in the new unsubstantiated charge. During the final arguments, Jovana Popovic had talked to Amanda at 8:45 p.m. not long before Meredith was attacked. She had been polite, rational, and willing to have Raffaele drive Jovana to the bus station if she so desired at midnight. Amanda's friend Madison Paxton also told CNN that she saw jurors sleeping every day she went to trial. The prosecutor sleeps. The jury sleeps. I've seen people on the podium, the president, Judge Massey, even answering his cell phone while the trial is going on. But every time the prosecutor spoke, the jury was wide awake. Douglas Preston also went on CNN and asked what happened to recordings that could clear up many questions about Amanda's confessions. Police had bugged the private conversations between Amanda and Raffaele out the station, even when they were talking where to order out for pizza. Why hadn't they had taped her questioning? The police first claimed that they had lost the videotape on the audio tape of the interrogation, he said. And then they claimed that they had never made one to begin with. And then they claimed that they don't even have the transcripts of this interrogation. Prosecutors Giuliani Menini and Manuela Cambodi meanwhile celebrated the verdict, regretting only that the defendants didn't get life sentences. Menini himself, however, still faced possible prison time as a result of his abuse of the office trial in Florence. Now dubbed the Foxy Noxy prosecutor by the Daily Mail, he would learn of his own fate in January 22, 2010, when he was not only convicted but also received a 16-month suspended sentence. He said he was surprised by the verdict. His conscience is clear. I know I did nothing wrong. Mr. Menini was also cleared through the appeal process of Italy. Mind you, Amanda Knox really dwells on him getting in trouble after her case to, press the point home that I don't suck, you suck. Whatever. The morning after the Knox-Lecito verdict, a worldwide backlash began, kicked off by a fiery statement by Maria Cantwell, a senator from Washington State, home of the Knox-Mellis families. I am saddened by the verdict, and I have serious questions from the Italian justice system as to whether the anti-Americanism tainted this trial. The prosecution did not present enough evidence for the impartial jury to conclude beyond a reasonable doubt that Miss Knox was guilty. Italian jurors were not sequestered and were allowed to view highly negative news coverage about Miss Knox. Other flaws in the Italian justice systems on display in this case also included the harsh treatment of Miss Knox following her arrest, negligent handling of evidence by investigators, and pending charges of misconduct against one of the prosecutors stemming from another murder trial. Cantwell had already taken her concerns to Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, who said on national television that she was busy with the crisis in the Afghan war and would be happy to listen to anyone who had information on the matter. Highly placed Italian officials complained of interference, echoing of the very anti-Americanism of which Cantwell had complained. How many times had Italian judges said that Amanda couldn't have house arrest, that she couldn't be trusted to stay in Italy because she was an American? Raffaele could not be let out either because his American girl could easily free him. Guantanamo Bay, which came up every time Amanda testified to being hit, once again floated through the coverage. Its connection to the brutal slashing of Meredith Kercher as tenuous as ever. One Italian police official said that he was surprised that the Americans had time for Perugia when the detention center at Guantanamo was still open. Douglas Preston and the other insiders blamed the verdict on La Fascia, the name for the Italian leaders to look good in the eyes of their citizens. The backlash wasn't hard to pin down. Where was the unassailable proof that the prosecutor had been promising for 2 years? He hadn't even nailed down a motive, resorting to poor hygiene in the ends. As Il Messaggero pointed out, women don't kill over messy bathrooms. Crime reporter Mau Ponte of La Repubblica, puffing on an unlit pipe in court, had complained about the trial's sideshow ambience ever since the English girls testified. "That's your motive?" he asked. "Homework, toilet flushing?" Now he was somewhat surprised at the verdict because of the inconsistency. 30 years for Rudy Gaudet, only 26 for Amanda Knox, supposedly the stabber. It was like the Pontius Pilate washing his hands, Mao told Time magazine. Manini spoke of Amanda's supposed hatred for Meredith, but those who actually lived with the two girls had never seen a moment of tension between them, nor heard Amanda utter a word of complaint about anything. Tranquilla, the flatmates had called the relationship between the two foreign girls normal, and they were testifying for the prosecution. Manini had wrapped up his case by asking the court to imagine a quarrel between two girls, putting his words into Amanda's mouth. When had the American girl ever called Meredith prissy or a little saint? When had the gracious Meredith ever presented herself as a smug, in a smug, unappealing way? Amanda had also helped herself considerably by testifying for 2 days, producing TV footage available to anybody on the web. Viewers saw the typical-looking American college student, bright, self-confident. She never lost her temper despite considerable prodding from Manini, Pacelli, and Maresca. She neither cried nor went into hysterics. She seemed plausible. In fact, she looked like the girl next door, which was Manini's first impression of her before he visualized group sex. Yet everything paled besides the discovery that the DNA results weren't reliable. When the top-flight American scientists had examined the LCN DNA testing for the knife and bra clasp, they cast great doubt on the results, released the letter of protest, and watched it pop up all over the internet. The Kercher jurors could have even read it had they been so inclined. Frank Sforza had studied the black mood in the courtroom while Judge Massey read the verdict. Where was the jubilation on the part of the jurors, he wondered, the pride and justice done? Judge Massey never glanced up from his papers, The other judge never gazed at him. The jurors just stood there. Kurt Knox made a point to look at each of them individually, but none met his eyes. As Savarzo wrote on Perugia Shock directly afterward, suddenly people realized there wasn't any motive. There wasn't any blood on the knife. There wasn't a trace of Amanda and Raffaele in Meredith's room. That drama played out in the courtroom. That's where people suddenly understood that there was no proof, no way to convict Amanda and Raffaele. But that wasn't to be certain beyond a reasonable doubt. Call it buyer's remorse worldwide. Only a few reporters showed up for Patrick Lamamba's press conference the day after the verdict, while the Kerchers drew a standing room-only crowd in the hotel room hearing where they'd met the first meet with the press on November 6, 2007. Then Stephanie had worn her black hair in a short bob falling over one eye, and now it reached her shoulders, a reminder of how much time had passed since her sister's murder. She entered the room first, accompanied by her father John and brothers Lyle and John Jr., and then Arlene straggled in looking exhausted. Her flushed face overshadowed by big, thick glasses. She had been confined to bed, getting up only long enough for the press conference, it turned out. The Kerchers exhibited their usual grace, patiently enduring the constant background noise and intrusion of the video cameras. Francesco Maresca, their lawyer, sat at the far right of the rectangular table, beaming as he started things off. He didn't seem to realize that he faced a changed world. This was nothing like the mood among the reporters after the conviction of Rudy Goudet. Investigators held grave evidence against Rudy, as the Supreme Court of Italy had said in 2008. So when Maresca once again praised the Kerchers for the elegance of silence, it felt like a silencing technique. Certainly, the case would have made for reasonable doubt, and it wasn't as if the prosecution had been classy. There's a girl killed, and they fantasized about orgies. Amanda's Perugiano lawyer, Luciano Gagara, had complained during his heated closing argument. They should be ashamed of that. They should be ashamed to have asked Giacomo Silenzi about sex. We refused to disrespect Meredith. We refused to ask about sex. We didn't even bring up the statements he had made about it. Moreover, the press had spent 2 years in close contacts with the Knox Millis and Slecito families. Whether they were guilty or not, many reporters had found it hard to listen to the parents' reactions while Judge Massey read the verdict in a monotone. Now 2 British reporters stood up at the press conference and asked the Kerchers if they really thought the 2 college students had killed Meredith, and whether it worried them that their lawyer basically mimicked everything the prosecution said. Stephanie wouldn't say. She held back. So did her father. But it was hard to miss his tight little smile because reporters had never seen him smile before. Lyle and John Jr. tossed a ball back and forth. The thing was, they insisted, you had to trust your lawyers. Arlene had a final word to say. You have to go with the evidence. There's nothing else. Later, she would blame the murder on Amanda's excesses, and John Kercher would tell the Daily Mail that charges of the anti-Americanism were ludicrous. I believe the verdict was based entirely on evidence, he said. I have to accept the things that I do not accept and I do not think are fair, Amanda said, when a delegation of Italian politicians visited her in prison within weeks of her condemnation. She outed that she felt sad and frightened at the thought of spending 26 years behind bars. The visitors found her in a new jail cell about 10 square feet, and she had shared with a 51-year-old prisoner, also American. Some reports would linger over the fact that this cell had its own bathroom, complete with toilet and bidet, and that Amanda was locked in 23 hours a day, and that she saw visitors only a few times a week, and that she was doing her best to stay busy, working in a prison laundry and exploring the library section of English books. She was also writing poetry and continuing to work on her UW courses. I was certain that the verdict would put an end to a nightmare. Instead, it didn't, Raffaelli said in a prison interview given through his lawyer. He too planned to appeal his verdict. When the sentencing was read, I didn't understand what had happened, and even now it seems impossible, and I still don't understand why I was convicted. He said Amanda was a very sweet girl, incapable of murder, and even though he was no longer in love with her, he still felt close. She is also in a nightmare, in a harrowing situation like mine. Meanwhile, Rudy Goudet's 30-year prison sentence was nearly cut in half on appeal. On December 22, 2009, his lawyers argued successfully that it didn't make sense for him to get life imprisonment when his alleged co-conspirators got less. Rudy said he wasn't happy about the reduction because I'm not guilty, and his lawyers vowed to appeal the Supreme Court for a full acquittal. As for the locals thought of the trial of the century, some saw Manini as a beleaguered visionary, and they pointed to the DNA evidence as proof of certain guilt. Others said that the prosecutor was a strange man, not a typical Prusiano, and that he'd helped police make a mess of things. It was a disgrace, they said, and nobody knew how to put it right. We are tired, parler. A local named Marililla insisted the morning after the verdict, complaining of the talk of the lawyers, the print reporters with their tiny tape recorders, the TV anchors setting up in the Brufanini. The armchair detectives on Italian television, and the shrill voices raised on the internet calling for blood. Even the bar chatter, it was all too much. Marilali wasn't about to give her theory on the crime, nor would she stone the convicted couple. What she wanted for every journalist was to shut up and to go home. We are not stupid here in Perugia. We already know what we think about the matter. The hilltop town cozy's sister city relationship with Seattle took a blow on January 1st, 2010, when officials scraped the name Perugia for a new park, citing local outrage at the Amanda Knox verdict. Perugia's mayor, Waldemiro Bacalali, didn't help matters by insisting that the UW honor student had received perfect treatment, but he vowed to repair Perugia's new and probably temporary rift with the Emerald City. Frank Sforza had been pretty certain that Amanda and Raffaelli were mixed up in a murder, and he began covering the Meredith mystery on Perugia Shock. Then Patrick, their suspect co-conspirator, turned out to be innocent. Police found Rudy Goudet's DNA everywhere. Giuliani Manini never altered his crime theory, simply subbing in Rudy for Patrick and assigning the same motives and certainties to this younger and entirely different suspect. Maybe, just maybe, Sforza thought no orgy took place that night. Eventually, he was able to study the excerpts, the reports, pore over the interrogation documents, evaluate the autopsy reports, view the crime scene video, and finally hear witness speak in open court, where he'd hoped to find concrete evidence. He discovered only speculation. A conviction with no proof. That is the darkness of the mind. He said after the verdict, 26 years in a cell, that is the horror. When you are innocent, that is the nightmare. But Frank Sforza believed the two college students would be freed upon their appeal, or in the worst hypothesis, the penalty would be reduced to about 15 years, and then the Supreme Court would cancel the conviction, and everything will end up with a toast of Tarracelli Ivano, as always, cookies and wine. That is the expression we use when there is an insolvable problem, when an irremediable conflict suddenly ends up with a good laugh, and everybody goes home as if nothing happened. Not even in the beautiful Umbria hills could a murder mystery reach a happy ending. But one could still raise a glass to the dead. On December 28th, we celebrate Meredith's birthday just as we did in 2008. Stephanie Kercher told reporters, "We will toast to Mez." That's it. We're done. Key takeaway. Amanda loves talking about the death of Meredith Kercher more than she ever liked being Meredith Kercher's friend. Nobody is making Amanda do a press tour. She's just doing these things because she likes the attention. Okay, bye.